If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. That's Sun Tzu. And it feels particularly relevant for what we're discussing today.
It really does. Sets the stage perfectly.
Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive. We take complex sources, pull out the key insights, and hopefully give you a clear picture of critical global issues.
And today, we're diving into a really significant topic. The intensifying Sino-US rivalry right there in the Indo-Pacific. It's crucial stuff.
Absolutely. Crucial for anyone following geopolitics, and maybe especially if you're preparing for exams like the UPSC, this is core current affairs.
Definitely prelims and mains relevance here.
We're basing our discussion today primarily on an insightful AFP report. Our mission really is to cut through the noise, look at the key moves, the strategies playing out in this power struggle.
Yeah, try to connect the dots between different events. Military, economic, it's all linked.
Exactly. We want to give you that holistic view. So let's get into it. We might find some surprising connections along the way.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Let's start with the military side. The South China Sea. Imagine a specific Thursday, fairly recently, two really big naval movements happening almost at the same time.
Okay.
First, you had the USS George Washington, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, Nimitz class, so, a major piece of hardware.
Huge. One of their flagships, really.
Right. It arrives off the coast of the Philippines near Manila for a port visit.
Now, a port visit might sound routine, but in this context, it's anything but. It's a very strong signal.
How so?
It clearly signals stepped-up defense cooperation between Washington and Manila, and it's pretty explicitly aimed at pushing back against China's big claims in the South China Sea.
It's a statement piece.
Definitely. It's putting a marker down.
And the ship's spokesman, Lieutenant Commander Mark Langford, basically said as much. The AFP report quotes him, "The U.S. Navy, along with our allies and partners, is committed to a free and open Indo-Pacific."
Standard line, but important reinforcement.
And he added, "These operations demonstrate the commitment to stability in the region, calling the Philippines a long-standing and critical ally."
That language, critical ally, is key. It highlights how this relationship has really deepened again.
Yeah, tell us more about that context, the U.S.-Philippines relationship.
Well, it's seen a significant boost since President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. came into office in 2022. He's taken a much stronger stance against Beijing's actions compared to his predecessor.
Right, a noticeable shift.
And don't forget, they have a mutual defense treaty going back to 1951. Plus, they've been ramping up joint exercises, like their first ever joint Coast Guard drills back in May.
So this carrier visit fits into that broader pattern of strengthening ties.
Exactly. It's reinforcing that revitalized alliance.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. On that exact same Thursday, China's first domestically built carrier, the Shandong, sailed into Hong Kong.
Wow. Okay. The same day. That's pointed.
It feels quite deliberate, doesn't it? What's the background on the Shandong's movements?
Well, it hadn't been idle. It was operating off the northern Philippines back in April, and it had just finished combat drills out in the Western Pacific, actually alongside China's other carrier, the Liaoning.
So China showing off its own naval power projection.
Precisely. And the timing, having both a U.S. carrier near the Philippines and a Chinese carrier in Hong Kong simultaneously, it really underscores the overt military dimension of this rivalry. It's like both sides are marking their presence.
And it happens against the backdrop of China's huge claims, right? Claiming almost the entire South China Sea.
Yeah, nearly all of it. A waterway carrying, over 60% of global sea trade?
Despite that international ruling saying the claim has no legal basis.
Right. The ruling is clear, but Beijing ignores it. And they're building the naval power to back up their assertions. Remember that U.S. DoD report from December?
Remind us.
It stated China now has the world's largest navy, over 370 ships and submarines in its battle force.
370. That's a massive fleet.
It is. So these carrier movements, they're not just symbolic visits. They are, like you said earlier, strategic chess moves. High-stakes signaling in a critical region.
Okay, so that's the military picture. Very visible, very assertive. But this contest isn't just about ships, is it? There's a huge economic dimension, too.
Absolutely. And the recent U.S.-Vietnam trade deal is a perfect example of how economics and geopolitics are intertwined here.
Let's unpack that. Vietnam has, the third largest trade surplus with the U.S. after China and Mexico?
That's right. And they were hit, or potentially going to be hit, quite hard by those Trump-era tariffs announced back in April, the Liberation Day tariffs.
Ah, yes, facing potentially very high rates.
Exactly. A potential 46% tariff was looming. But this new deal, announced recently, avoided that.
So what's in the deal?
It's actually the first full trade agreement Trump has finalized with an Asian country. And some analysts are looking at it as maybe a kind of template for Washington's future approach.
Interesting. A template for what exactly?
Well, instead of the 46% rate, Vietnam now faces a minimum 20% tariff. But in return, it has to open its markets more to U.S. goods, including things like cars.
So market access for tariff reduction. Seems standard.
On the surface, yes. But many see the underlying goal as less about pure trade and more about strategic economic maneuvering, trying to reshape supply chains, maybe reduce reliance on China.
Ah, so it loops back to the rivalry again.
Very much so, even if it puts countries like Vietnam in a difficult position.
And there was a really contentious part, wasn't there? Something about transshipping.
Yes, that's crucial. The deal includes a 40% tariff on goods that are basically just passing through Vietnam to avoid higher U.S. tariffs on goods from, say, China.
Transshipping. Trying to clamp down on that loophole.
Right. Washington has accused Hanoi of this before, relabeling Chinese goods. But it's complicated because, as the report notes, raw materials from China are the lifeblood for many Vietnamese factories.
So Vietnam's caught in the middle, needs Chinese inputs but needs the U.S. market, and now faces pressure on how those goods flow.
Exactly. It's a very fine line to walk. And the initial reactions really highlighted this tension.
What did the observers say?
Well, Capital Economics pointed out pretty bluntly, this deal, again, seems in large part to be about China. They felt the transshipment part would be seen as a provocation in Beijing.
And did Beijing react?
Oh, yes. China's foreign ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning responded quickly, saying that negotiations and agreements, quote, should not target or harm the interests of third parties. Pretty clear who they think the third party is.
No prizes for guessing there. What about the markets? How did they take the news?
It was a bit of a roller coaster. Initially, shares of companies heavily invested in Vietnam, like clothing and sports gear makers, they rose in New York.
Good news. Tariffs averted.
But then, as the details emerged, especially around the transshipment rules, those same shares fell sharply. The devil really is in the details, you know.
It always is. What are the analysts on the ground saying? Cautiously optimistic.
More like just cautious. People like Dan Martin from Des Shira and Associates basically said, look, it's better than 46%, but hold the celebrations.
That's the caution.
Because everything hinges on how the U.S. interprets and enforces this transshipment idea. Martin warned it could hit companies playing by the rules if the U.S. definition is too broad.
I see. Uncertainty remains.
Yeah, and Adam Sitkoff from AmCham in Hanoi echoed that. He said the deal gives Vietnam some certainty, which is good, but without knowing exactly how the tariffs work, it's hard to judge the pros and cons. His quote was quite telling. The answers can be the difference between celebrating or crying.
Wow. High stakes for Vietnamese businesses.
Definitely. And even a Vietnam foreign ministry spokesman mentioned negotiators were still in detailed discussion to concretize agreements, so it wasn't fully nailed down, it seems.
Which leads to the big question, the one Bloomberg Economics called the looming question. What does this actually mean for Vietnam's economy?
Well, their forecast wasn't exactly cheerful. Bloomberg Economics predicted Vietnam could potentially lose about a quarter of its U.S. exports over the medium term.
A quarter? That's huge.
It is. That could potentially knock off over 2% of their GDP. So, as Jack Sheehan of DFDL pointed out, the Vietnamese government is now under real pressure to enforce those country of origin rules very strictly.
To avoid triggering those transshipment tariffs.
Exactly. But the biggest unknown, the real wild card, is China's reaction.
Right. What are the potential diplomatic or economic consequences there?
Rana Sajady, another Bloomberg economics expert, highlighted this. The uncertainty around defining and enforcing transshipment. That's likely to have diplomatic fallout. She stressed Beijing has already warned it would retaliate against deals hurting Chinese interests.
And this deal, particularly the transshipment part, could fall into that category.
It very well could. Sajady's warning was stark. Any retaliation from China could have an outsized impact on Vietnam's economy, given how interconnected they are.
So these economic deals, they're not just trade figures. They are absolutely geopolitical tools, aren't they?
Completely. Economic statecraft. It's just as important as the military posturing in this rivalry. Two sides of the same coin.
Okay, let's try and synthesize this. We've seen these seemingly separate things.
Yeah.
Carriers moving in the South China Sea, a complex trade deal with Vietnam. How do they really fit together to paint that bigger picture of the U.S.-China competition?
Well, I think they show the multi-front nature of this rivalry. It's a contest for influence, for economic dominance right across the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
On one hand, you have the direct military presence, the alliance building, like the U.S.-Philippines cooperation. That's about security, presence, pushing back
Of a
physically.
power aspect. Yeah.
Exactly. On the other hand, you have the economic leverage. Trade deals, tariffs, supply chain adjustments like the Vietnam deal. That's about using economic tools for strategic goals, maybe containing China's economic reach or offering alternatives,
So military and economic pressure working in tandem, perhaps.
or at least working towards similar strategic objectives from Washington's perspective. And this raises a really critical question, especially for you listening. How do the smaller countries in the region, like the Philippines, like Vietnam, actually navigate this? They're caught between these two giants.
That must be an incredible balancing act. Constant pressure.
Immense pressure requires very deft diplomacy.
So for our listeners, especially those preparing for exams like UPSC or just trying to make sense of global news, what's the key takeaway here?
I think the main thing is seeing the connections. Don't look at a military exercise or a trade deal in isolation. You have to understand how the military, economic, and diplomatic pieces all influence each other. That gives you the holistic view, the well-rounded understanding that's so crucial.
It's about seeing the whole chessboard, not just individual moves.
Precisely.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, the main points are the U.S. seems to be using this dual strategy, boosting military alliances, and using strategic trade deals to counter China's influence.
Right. And this forces regional players into really complex calculations, balancing economic needs with security concerns.
So a final thought, perhaps a provocative one for you to mull over.
Go on.
As this rivalry keeps heating up, what are the long-term impacts going to be? Think about global trade routes, regional stability. Are we seeing a fundamental shift?
And tied to that, how will these Indo-Pacific nations manage? Can they balance their vital economic links, often with China, against growing security worries and partnerships, often leaning towards the U.S.? That balancing act is the story to watch, I think.
Lots to think about there. Definitely layers of complexity to consider as you follow the news.
For sure.
Well, if you found this deep dive valuable, if it gave you some insight, we'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button. Please subscribe if you haven't already for more analyses like this.
And do share your thoughts or any questions you have in the comments below. We genuinely find the questions and perspectives really useful.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for joining us on the deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.